At 9 a.m. local time in Moscow, inside the Kremlin, the faces of Russia's top leaders showed one thing: desperation. Crimea, once paraded as Putin's greatest prize, was running dry. No water, no fuel, and no hope. Across the peninsula, people lined up for hours at empty gas stations. Drivers sat in the scorching sun, desperate for a few drops of fuel. Tourists who were promised a summer getaway, stranded on the Kerch Bridge, sweating in their cars, swearing they would never return. For the Kremlin, the answer was simple, or so they thought. A massive fuel train, loaded with hundreds of tankers, was sent racing toward Crimea. It was advertised as the peninsula's lifeline, the final solution to the crisis. But within hours, that so-called lifeline would erupt into a fireball, painting the sky black with smoke. What Moscow called the last hope would instead become a symbol of total failure. How did Ukraine turn one train into a disaster that shook the entire Russian war machine? Stay with me, because this is the moment Crimea's fate changed. Before the strike ever happened, Crimea was already in crisis. Reservoirs were drying up. Farmlands were splitting open under the summer heat. In many towns, water dripped from taps one drop at a time. For ordinary families, every bucket of water became a daily struggle. The Kremlin rushed to respond. Tanker trucks were ferried in from the mainland. Freight trains carried thousands of tons of water. Officials boasted on TV that the problem was under control. But on the ground, the truth looked very different. Supplies barely scratched the surface. Every solution felt like patching a sinking ship. Then came the fuel problem. Lines of cars snaked around gas stations, stretching for blocks. Tempers flared as pumps ran dry. Prices shot up overnight. And just as frustration boiled over, Moscow launched a new tourism campaign, urging Russians to spend their summer vacation in Crimea. That gamble backfired instantly. Tens of thousands of visitors poured in, overwhelming an infrastructure that could not even support its own people. Families sat stranded on the Kerch Bridge for hours, their cars overheating in the sun. Instead of relaxing on the beaches, tourists cursed the Kremlin and swore never to return. Behind the scenes, the situation was even worse. Every liter of fuel diverted to gas stations was fuel taken away from the war front. Tanks, trucks, and artillery all depended on the same scarce supply. By trying to please both civilians and the military, Russia ended up satisfying neither. And yet, Moscow continued the show. State TV repeated the same line: everything is stable, everything is under control. But people on the ground knew it was a lie. The peninsula was cracking under pressure, socially, economically, and militarily. Crimea, the jewel Russia bragged about to the world, was starting to look less like a victory and more like a ticking time bomb. By midsummer, desperation turned into chaos. Gas stations across Crimea looked like scenes from another century. Cars stretched for miles, waiting hours just to pump a few liters, if there was anything left to pump at all. Tempers boiled over, drivers shouted, fights broke out, and rumors spread of black market sales at triple the price. For many families, even getting to work or buying groceries became impossible. Faced with growing unrest, Moscow reached for a tool straight out of the Soviet playbook: fuel rationing. Coupons were handed out. Each person was allowed a fixed amount, no matter how much money they had. The message was clear. This was no longer about choice. It was about survival. At first, rationing calmed the chaos. Lines shortened. The black market went quiet. But the relief was an illusion, because behind the scenes, the problem wasn't just about civilians. The Russian army itself was running dry. Tanks and armored trucks sat idle, their engines silent. Convoys were delayed. Supply routes slowed to a crawl. Every gallon given to a taxi driver was a gallon stolen from a battlefield. And in a war built on heavy machinery, that trade-off was fatal. Meanwhile, state television kept repeating the same tired phrase: everything is under control. But for people living in Crimea, those words rang hollow. They could see the truth with their own eyes: empty pumps, dead engines, and a government trapped in denial. Russia's so-called Victory Peninsula was slipping into a crisis it could no longer hide. And as the shortages deepened, Moscow prepared what it called its last, desperate solution. For the Kremlin, the answer seemed simple. If Crimea was starving for fuel, then send more fuel. And so Moscow rolled out what it called its final solution, a massive train convoy carrying hundreds of tankers filled with diesel and gasoline. State media bragged about it. This train, they said, would keep Crimea alive. But there was one problem. Ukraine knew about it. For weeks, reconnaissance drones had been circling the railway lines in Zaporizhia. Ukrainian intelligence tracked the convoy almost step by step, watching as it crawled closer to the peninsula. What looked to Russia like a lifeline looked to Ukraine like the perfect target. At 10:32 a.m., the trap was sprung. Ukrainian drones descended on the moving train. Within seconds, explosions ripped through the wagons. One tanker after another erupted into fireballs. Black smoke towered into the sky, so high it could be seen for miles. The so-called last hope was now a rolling inferno. Footage spread instantly. Videos showed flames devouring the train, cars derailed, and debris scattered across the tracks. What was meant to save Crimea had instead paralyzed it. In Kiev, officials issued a statement with just a few words: Russian logistics reduced to zero. For Moscow, those words cut deeper than any drone strike. Repair crews rushed to the site, but the damage was overwhelming. The tracks were twisted and broken. Tankers continued to burn long after the initial strike. Clearing the wreckage would take days, if not weeks. And during that time, Crimea's main artery for fuel was completely severed. The Kremlin's lifeline had become its biggest humiliation. The strike left Crimea cut off. The railway, the peninsula's fuel artery, was gone. Tankers burned on the tracks, and twisted steel made the line unusable. For days, nothing could move in or out. Russia scrambled to improvise. Trucks were ordered to haul fuel by road, but that plan collapsed almost immediately. Convoys were too small to meet demand, too slow to make a difference, and too exposed to Ukrainian drones. Each mile driven was another mile of risk. That left only the Kerch Bridge, but the bridge was already a nightmare. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Families sat stranded in sweltering heat, their cars out of gas, their air conditioners silent. Videos showed parents fanning their children with cardboard, while tourists cursed Moscow for ruining their vacations. Instead of restoring confidence, the Kremlin created panic. Social media filled with images of chaos, empty stations, broken down vehicles, and endless lines of angry drivers. The very campaign meant to promote Crimea as a safe summer destination now served as proof of its collapse. And then came the information blackout. Internet service across Crimea was suddenly cut off. Officials claimed it was for security reasons, but people knew the truth. Moscow was trying to silence them, to stop pictures and videos from leaking out. The blackout only fueled more anger. Residents felt abandoned, trapped in the heat with no fuel, no water, and now no voice. Crimea was supposed to be Russia's showcase. Instead, it had become a stranded island, a place where every road led to frustration, and every promise from Moscow turned out to be a lie. The loss of that single train created a problem the Kremlin could not solve. Moscow now faced a brutal choice: send fuel to Crimea or send fuel to the front. It could not do both. The impact was immediate. Russian armored vehicles sat silent. Supply trucks never left their depots. Artillery crews waited for fuel that never came. What was once a steady flow of diesel became a trickle, and the rhythm of Russia's war machine broke down. Ukraine didn't need to match Russia tank for tank or gun for gun. Instead, it struck at the veins that kept those tanks alive. By targeting railways, depots, and bridges, Kiev forced Moscow into paralysis without firing a single shot on the front line. This is modern warfare. The battlefield is no longer just trenches and open fields. It stretches hundreds of miles into the rear. Every supply line, every depot, every bridge is a target, and Ukraine has mastered that reality. Each drone strike might look small, a single UAV slamming into a tanker or depot, but the chain reaction it sets off is enormous. One lost train means fuel shortages. Fuel shortages mean stalled tanks. Stalled tanks mean failed offensives. The message is clear. Russia's so-called invincible army depends on fragile logistics. And when those lifelines are cut, the entire war effort collapses. For Ukraine, every successful strike is proof that strategy matters more than size. And for Russia, each burned convoy is a reminder that its war machine is bleeding out from within. The fallout from Crimea's crisis was not limited to fuel or water. It hit politics, and it hit hard. For ordinary residents, life became unbearable. Hours in fuel lines, days without stable internet, nights without air conditioning. People felt abandoned by the very government that promised protection. The Kremlin once sold Crimea as a symbol of Russian pride. Now, that symbol was cracking. Tourism, once touted as a success story, collapsed. Families who came for summer vacations swore they would never return. Businesses shuttered. Local anger spread, quietly but steadily, from streets to dinner tables. What was supposed to showcase Russian strength had turned into a glaring weakness. Inside Russia, the image of Crimea as Putin's forever prize began to fade. Each new shortage, each blackout, each strike made the peninsula look less like a jewel and more like a burden. Moscow poured billions into holding it, but could not even keep gas in the pumps. And the world was watching. Western analysts openly asked, if Russia cannot keep Crimea supplied, how can it sustain a war across Ukraine? Every lost convoy weakened Moscow not only on the battlefield, but also at the negotiating table. A superpower unable to protect its showcase territory looked less like a giant and more like a failing empire. Ukraine's strategy was working on every level. Militarily, it froze Russian advances. Politically, it exposed the Kremlin's lies. Internationally, it raised doubts about Russia's staying power. The strikes on Crimea weren't just explosions on a map. They were cracks in the image of Russian control. And once an image like that begins to break, it is nearly impossible to put back together. From the very beginning, this crisis followed a clear pattern. It started with water shortages, dry reservoirs, cracked soil, and families carrying buckets just to survive. Then came the fuel lines, cars stretched for miles, tempers flaring, prices climbing. Moscow promised quick fixes, but every solution crumbled as soon as it was announced. The final gamble was the train. A massive convoy of fuel wagons rolled out as the so-called Lifeline for Crimea. State TV hailed it as the answer, the proof that Russia was still in control. But in less than an hour, Ukraine reduced it to a smoldering wreck. What the Kremlin called its last hope turned into black smoke rising above the peninsula. And with that strike, everything unraveled. The railway collapsed. The Kerch Bridge jammed with stranded vehicles. Internet blackouts silenced voices, but only fueled more resentment. Tourism collapsed. The local population, once told they were safer under Russian rule, now faced life without fuel, without water, and without trust. What once was Putin's proudest trophy is now his heaviest burden. Crimea is no longer the jewel of Russian power. It's the proof of Russian weakness. Every drone strike exposes the cracks in Moscow's war machine. Every convoy destroyed reminds the world that Russia's strength is an illusion held together by fragile supply lines. Ukraine has shown that modern war is not only fought with tanks and missiles, it is fought by cutting the arteries of an enemy, striking deep into the lifelines they cannot defend. A single UAV, costing a fraction of a Russian tank, can paralyze an entire front. And in Crimea, that strategy has worked brilliantly. So the question now is simple. How much longer can Russia hold on? Will the Kerch Bridge be the next to fall? And if it does, can Moscow ever recover its grip on Crimea? What do you think? How long can Russia keep this crumbling peninsula under control? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to follow every twist in this war, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the story of Crimea is far from over.